It was an overcast Tuesday morning, and the sky hung low, cloaked in shades of gray. The air outside was cool and damp, a hint of rain in the breeze. Inside the massive glass lobby of one of Silicon Valley's most exclusive corporate campuses, Brian Carter adjusted his uniform and took his place at the security desk. Another day on the job, he thought, just like the one before it. To the employees who streamed in and out of the building daily, Brian was a fixture of the background, polite but forgettable. Most gave him a cursory nod at best, averted eyes at worst. Few stopped to exchange more than a word or two. To them, he was just the security guy, someone tasked with opening doors, checking badges, and ensuring protocols were followed. But Brian Carter was far more than he seemed. Life had dealt him a mix of challenges and setbacks, but Brian had always been the kind of person to keep moving forward. He wasn't bitter, he was practical. Each job, no matter how small or overlooked, was a stepping stone. Security work was his latest step. Though the hours were long and the respect minimal, Brian took his role seriously. He prided himself on doing things the right way, even when no one seemed to care. Brian's journey to the security desk wasn't a straight path. Once upon a time, he had been a star student with a promising future in computer science. College recruiters had sought him out, impressed by his sharp mind and innovative ideas. But dreams often collide with reality, and Brian's reality came in the form of mounting family responsibilities. His father's health had declined rapidly during his senior year of high school, leaving Brian to juggle part-time jobs, caregiving, and his studies. Despite his best efforts, something had to give, and that something was his college education. Brian took a break to support his family, telling himself it was only temporary. But temporary stretched into years, and soon he found himself taking whatever jobs he could find to make ends meet. Eventually, security work became his mainstay. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And Brian had a knack for it. He was observant, methodical, and unflappable in tense situations. His supervisors praised him for his diligence, though promotions were rare in a field where turnover was high and appreciation scarce. On that particular Tuesday morning, Brian arrived early, as usual. He liked to give himself extra time to prepare. The lobby was quiet in the early hours, the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft whir of the automatic doors the only sounds. He scanned the schedule for the day, noting a series of high-profile meetings. Nothing unusual, this building was a hub for tech moguls and startups alike. Still, Brian's sense of duty pushed him to review every detail. He double-checked the visitor list, ensured the badge printer was functional, and tested the security system's alerts. In his mind, small oversights led to big problems. By the time employees began trickling in, Brian was in his element. He greeted each person with a polite nod, scanning their badges with precision. Most people barely acknowledged him, their eyes glued to phones or the floor. It didn't bother Brian. He was used to being invisible. What Brian didn't realize was that his unassuming presence masked a strength few people noticed, his unwavering commitment to rules and fairness. Unlike others who might cut corners or bend under pressure, Brian believed that rules existed for a reason. He wasn't rigid for the sake of it. He had learned, through hard experiences, that skipping steps often led to disaster. His commitment wasn't just theoretical. Years earlier, during one of his first security jobs, Brian had let his guard down just once. A man had talked his way past the checkpoint, claiming he was late for an important meeting and had forgotten his ID. Brian, eager to avoid a scene, had allowed him through. It turned out to be a mistake with far-reaching consequences. The man wasn't an employee but a disgruntled ex-partner of someone in the building. Though no one was physically harmed, the incident caused chaos, leading to an evacuation and a formal inquiry. Brian had kept his job but carried the weight of that decision ever since. From that day forward, he swore never to let anything slip through the cracks. No badge, no entry, no exceptions. It was a simple rule: but one he followed religiously. As the morning unfolded, the pace in the lobby picked up. Employees hurried in, juggling coffee cups and laptops. A few visitors arrived, some nervous, others confident. Brian handled each interaction with calm efficiency. Around mid-morning, something unusual happened. A sleek black car pulled up to the front gate, the kind of car that turned heads even in Silicon Valley. Brian glanced at the vehicle, his instincts immediately on high alert. The man who stepped out was dressed casually: jeans, a hoodie, and sneakers. He didn't look like the typical visitor. Most executives arrived in suits or business attire, projecting authority. This man, however, carried an air of casual confidence that seemed out of place yet oddly commanding. As the man approached the desk, Brian straightened up. "Good morning, sir. May I see your ID?" The man hesitated, his expression unreadable. "I'm here for a meeting," he said, his tone brisk. Brian noticed the slight edge in the man's voice. He had encountered all types: impatient, dismissive, even hostile. But something about this interaction felt different. "Of course," Brian said, maintaining his professional demeanor. "I just need to check your name and credentials." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, as if the request was unexpected. "I'm Elon," he said simply, as though that explained everything. Brian blinked. The name sounded familiar, but he didn't react immediately. "Elon," he prompted, his tone polite but firm. "Elon Musk," the man said, his voice carrying a hint of exasperation. For a split second, Brian's mind raced. The name was undeniably recognizable, yet his training kicked in. It didn't matter who the man claimed to be. Protocol was protocol. "I understand, sir," Brian said evenly, "but I still need to see your ID or badge." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting between disbelief and amusement. "You're serious?" "Absolutely, sir," Brian replied, his tone calm but resolute. To the onlookers in the lobby, the interaction seemed surreal. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd as people realized who was standing at the desk. But Brian remained focused. His job wasn't to cater to celebrity or wealth, it was to ensure the safety and integrity of the building. What Brian didn't know was that this moment, seemingly mundane, would soon become anything but. The air in the lobby grew tense as more employees began to notice the exchange. Whispers traveled like wildfire, spreading from one person to the next. "Is that who I think it is?" one employee murmured to their colleague. Another person peeked over the top of their laptop, their fingers frozen mid-typing. "Is that Elon Musk?" Brian, however, remained oblivious to the growing commotion. His focus was locked on the man standing before him. Whether this was truly Elon Musk or not didn't matter. The rules were clear: everyone had to follow protocol, no exceptions. The man leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of Brian's desk. "Look," he said, his tone softer now but still laced with impatience, "I don't have my badge. But I'm here for an important meeting. Just let me through." Brian held his ground. "I understand, sir," he said evenly, "but without proper identification, I can't grant access. If you're on the schedule, I can call up to confirm your appointment." The man sighed, straightening up and crossing his arms. "You don't get it, do you? I don't need an appointment. I own the company." By now, the whispers in the lobby had grown into a quiet buzz. Employees paused on their way to elevators, their curiosity getting the better of them. Some pulled out their phones, snapping quick pictures or recording video. But Brian was undeterred. He had seen his fair share of bold claims over the years. People often exaggerated their importance to avoid security checks, and Brian had learned to stay impartial, no matter how convincing or intimidating they sounded. "Sir," Brian said, keeping his tone professional, "if that's the case, then it should be easy to verify your identity. I just need to make a quick call. The man looked at Brian, his lips pressing into a thin line. It was clear he wasn't used to being questioned, let alone stopped at a security desk. Still, there was something in his expression. Was it amusement? Respect, that suggested he wasn't entirely angry. The moments stretched on as the tension built. More employees gathered discreetly at the edges of the lobby, pretending to check emails or sip coffee but clearly focused on the interaction. A woman in a sleek black suit approached cautiously, her high heels clicking against the polished floor. "Brian," she said quietly, leaning toward him, "do you know who that is?" Brian glanced at her briefly, then turned back to the man. "He says he's Elon Musk," Brian replied, his voice steady. The woman's eyes widened, and she glanced nervously at the man in the hoodie. "That is Elon Musk," she whispered urgently. "He's the CEO of—" "I understand," Brian interrupted, his tone calm but firm, "but I still need to follow protocol. If he's the CEO, it'll be easy to verify." The woman hesitated, glancing back at Musk. "I'll call upstairs," she said quickly, pulling out her phone. Brian stayed focused on the task at hand. Despite the growing attention and the murmurs around him, he didn't let the situation rattle him. His job wasn't about making people happy, it was about ensuring security. He had learned that bending the rules, even once, could lead to serious consequences. As he waited for the woman to make her call, Brian turned his attention back to Musk. "Thank you for your patience, sir," he said politely. Musk raised an eyebrow. "You're really sticking to this, huh?" "Yes, sir," Brian replied without hesitation. "It's my responsibility to ensure everyone who enters this building is authorized. No exceptions." Musk's expression shifted again, this time to one of faint curiosity. "You don't see that kind of commitment much these days," he said, almost to himself. Meanwhile, the woman in the black suit was speaking frantically into her phone. "Yes, he's standing right here," she said, her voice low but urgent. "No, he doesn't have his badge." "Yes, I know who he is. Can someone come down here and sort this out?" The minutes ticked by, each one adding to the tension in the room. Musk glanced at his watch, then back at Brian. "You're really willing to hold up my day over a badge?" Brian nodded. "Yes, sir. Everyone follows the same rules. It's not personal, it's policy." For a moment, Musk stared at Brian, his expression unreadable. Then, to Brian's surprise, a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Fair enough," Musk said, stepping back slightly. Finally, the elevator doors dinged open, and a man in an expensive suit hurried out. His face was flushed, and his tie was slightly askew, as though he had thrown it on in a rush. "Mr. Musk," he called out, his voice breathless. Musk turned, his expression neutral. "Took you long enough," he said dryly. The man skidded to a halt in front of the desk, his eyes darting between Musk and Brian. "I'm so sorry for the confusion," he said quickly. "This is, of course, Mr. Elon Musk. He's cleared to enter." Brian nodded but didn't waver. "I'll still need to log his entry," he said. "It's standard procedure." The man in the suit blinked, clearly taken aback. Of course," he stammered. As Brian logged Musk's information, the CEO watched him with an expression that was equal parts intrigued and impressed. When Brian finished, he handed Musk a temporary visitor badge. "Here you go, sir. You're all set." Musk took the badge, slipping it into his pocket. "You're a stickler for the rules," he said, his tone almost teasing. "I just do my job, sir," Brian replied simply. Musk nodded, a faint smile still on his face. "Good. We need more people like that." With that, Musk turned and headed toward the elevators, the man in the suit trailing behind him. As the lobby returned to its usual rhythm, the crowd of employees slowly dispersed, though the buzz of whispered conversations lingered. Some looked at Brian with newfound respect, others seemed amused by the situation. But Brian didn't dwell on it. He simply straightened his uniform, checked his desk for any pending tasks, and prepared for the next visitor. Little did he know, the events of that morning were only the beginning of something far greater. The morning had unfolded like any other. The steady rhythm of badge checks, casual nods, and the occasional hurried thanks filled Brian Carter's first few hours on duty. He had grown accustomed to the monotony of the routine. Most employees barely acknowledged his presence as they breezed past him, their thoughts already consumed by meetings, deadlines, or their next cup of coffee. Brian kept his focus sharp, though. It wasn't just a job to him, it was a responsibility. He didn't mind the undercurrent of assumptions that came with his role. Security guards weren't typically seen as anything more than obstacles to navigate or silent fixtures of the background. Still, Brian took pride in ensuring the building stayed secure. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Around mid-morning, as the pace of foot traffic slowed, a low hum broke the usual pattern. The sound of a sleek engine purring to a stop outside caught Brian's attention. He looked up from his station to see a jet-black car parked just beyond the gate. The vehicle exuded quiet luxury, its tinted windows hiding whoever sat inside. Brian's gut instinct kicked in. Something about the scene felt different, not necessarily threatening, but unusual enough to make him sit up straighter. He watched as the car door swung open, and a man stepped out. The man's attire immediately stood out. Instead of the tailored suits Brian usually associated with the building's high-profile visitors, this man wore jeans, a hoodie, and well-worn sneakers. His casual appearance contrasted sharply with the polished sheen of the car behind him. The man strode toward the security desk with purposeful steps, his face set in an expression of mild irritation. Brian noticed how his body language radiated impatience, as though every second wasted here was an affront. "I'm here for the meeting," the man said briskly, without offering any pleasantries. His tone was clipped, bordering on dismissive. Brian met the man's gaze, his expression calm and professional. He'd dealt with all kinds of personalities in this job: impatient executives, flustered interns, even a few outright rude individuals. "I'll need to see your ID, sir," Brian said, his voice steady. The man stopped short and sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look," he said, his voice carrying an edge, "I don't have time for this. Do you know who I am?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Brian tilted his head slightly, studying the man's face. He did look familiar, but Brian couldn't immediately place him. In his line of work, being cautious was second nature. Assumptions could lead to mistakes, and mistakes in security could have serious consequences. "I'm sorry, sir," Brian replied, his tone measured, "but I'll still need to see some form of identification before I can let you through." The man let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking his head. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. Then, louder, he said, "I'm Elon Musk." The name landed like a thunderclap. Brian blinked, his mind racing. Of course, he'd heard of Elon Musk, who hadn't? The name was synonymous with innovation, ambition, and, admittedly, controversy. Musk's face was plastered across countless headlines, his every move dissected by the media. But training overrode recognition. Brian couldn't afford to let celebrity or status sway his judgment. Protocol was protocol, and everyone, no matter who they claimed to be, had to follow it. "I understand, sir," Brian said, keeping his tone polite but firm, "but I'll still need to verify your identity. If you don't have your badge, I can check the system or call upstairs to confirm your appointment." Musk's expression shifted. For a moment, it was as if he couldn't decide whether to be amused or annoyed. "You're serious?" he asked, crossing his arms. "Absolutely, sir," Brian replied without hesitation. The exchange drew the attention of several nearby employees. People passing through the lobby began to slow down, their curiosity piqued by the interaction. Whispers rippled through the growing crowd as recognition dawned. "Wait, is that Elon Musk?" one person murmured. "Why is he arguing with security?" another whispered. Despite the murmurs, Brian stayed focused. He couldn't afford to be distracted by the growing audience. His responsibility was clear: to ensure the safety and integrity of the building, no matter who stood in front of him. Musk sighed again, pulling out his phone and glancing at the time. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "I don't have a badge on me. Just let me through, I'm already late." "I understand the inconvenience, sir," Brian said, his tone even, "but without proper identification, I can't allow access. If you'd like, I can assist you with obtaining a temporary visitor badge." Musk raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of disbelief and irritation. "Do you really think I need a visitor badge?" Brian nodded. "Yes, sir. It's standard procedure for everyone without a badge, regardless of their position." By now, the scene had become a spectacle. Employees lingered near the edges of the lobby, pretending to check emails or sip coffee while keeping a close eye on the exchange. Some discreetly recorded video on their phones, eager to capture what was shaping up to be an unforgettable moment. A woman in a sharp navy blazer approached cautiously, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Excuse me, Brian," she said softly, leaning toward him. "Do you know who that is?" "Yes, ma'am," Brian replied calmly. "He says he's Elon Musk." The woman glanced at Musk, her eyes widening slightly. "That is Elon Musk," she whispered urgently. "He's here for a meeting with the board." "I understand," Brian said, maintaining his professional tone, "but I still need to follow protocol. If he's expected, I can verify his appointment and issue a temporary badge." The woman hesitated, clearly torn. She turned to Musk, her face apologetic. "I'll call upstairs to sort this out," she said quickly, pulling out her phone. Musk, meanwhile, studied Brian with a look that was difficult to read. There was frustration, certainly, but also a flicker of something else: respect, perhaps. "You're really not going to budge on this, are you?" Musk asked, his tone softer now. "No, sir," Brian said. "It's my job to ensure everyone follows the same rules." Musk's lips twitched as if suppressing a smile. "Fair enough," he said, stepping back slightly. The woman in the navy blazer spoke hurriedly into her phone. "Yes, he's standing right here," she said, her voice low but urgent. "No, he doesn't have his badge. Can someone from the board come down to confirm his entry?" Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the tension in the lobby thickened. Musk glanced at his watch again, clearly growing impatient. Brian, however, remained steadfast. His job wasn't about making exceptions, it was about ensuring the safety of everyone in the building. Finally, the elevator doors dinged open, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his expression frazzled. "Mr. Musk," he called out, hurrying toward the desk. Musk turned, his expression neutral. "Took you long enough," he said dryly. The man reached the desk, slightly out of breath. "I'm so sorry for the delay," he said quickly, glancing nervously at Brian. "This is, of course, Mr. Elon Musk. He's here for a meeting with the board." Brian nodded, unflustered. "I'll just need to log his entry and issue a temporary badge," he said. The man in the suit looked momentarily confused but nodded quickly. "Of course," he said. As Brian processed Musk's information and prepared the temporary badge, he noticed Musk watching him closely. There was something about the CEO's gaze, a quiet intensity, as if he were evaluating Brian on a deeper level. When Brian handed over the badge, Musk accepted it with a small nod. You're thorough, Musk said, his tone thoughtful. I like that. I just do my job, sir, Brian replied simply. Musk studied him for another moment, then smiled faintly. Good. Keep doing it. With that, Musk headed toward the elevators, leaving behind a lobby full of stunned employees and a story that would be talked about for weeks to come. As Elon Musk disappeared into the elevator, the room buzzed with murmurs and quiet laughter. The employees who had been watching slowly dispersed, their eyes occasionally flicking back toward Brian, some with amusement, others with newfound respect. Brian took a deep breath and returned his focus to the computer screen in front of him. Despite the encounter, he knew there were still visitors to check in and deliveries to log. The building didn't stop moving just because the world's richest man had shown up unannounced. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the lingering tension in the air. He could still feel the weight of all the eyes that had been on him, judging his every move. Some might have thought he was too rigid, others might have admired his consistency, but it wasn't about what they thought. For Brian, it was simple, the rules existed for a reason. Letting one person slide could create cracks in the system. He'd seen firsthand how quickly those cracks could grow into something unmanageable. Across the lobby, a group of employees stood near a coffee machine, whispering animatedly. I can't believe he actually stopped Elon Musk, one of them said, shaking his head. That guy has guts. Or he's just stubborn, another replied, chuckling. I mean, come on. That's Elon Musk. Who needs a badge when you're literally the face of half the tech industry? Still, a third chimed in, he's got a point. If Brian lets Musk waltz in without following the rules, what's to stop someone else from doing the same thing? What if it wasn't Musk but someone pretending to be him? The others nodded slowly, the reality of the situation sinking in. Meanwhile, upstairs in the boardroom, Musk had settled into his meeting, his earlier irritation seemingly forgotten. Yet, as the discussion moved from one topic to another, his thoughts occasionally drifted back to the security guard. There had been something about Brian, his unwavering calm, his polite but firm tone that had struck a chord. Musk had encountered countless people who bent over backward to accommodate him, who flinched at the slightest hint of his displeasure. Brian was different. He had stood his ground, treating Musk not as a celebrity or a billionaire, but as just another person subject to the same rules as everyone else. It was refreshing. Back at the front desk, Brian's day continued as usual, though the encounter with Musk remained fresh in his mind. He hadn't been nervous during the exchange. His years of experience had taught him to stay composed under pressure, but now, in the quiet moments between tasks, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd done the right thing. Would his supervisors commend him for sticking to protocol, or would they reprimand him for potentially offending such a high-profile figure? Brian shook off the thought. Doubts were unproductive, and second-guessing himself wouldn't change anything. He had done what he believed was right, and that was all that mattered. The afternoon passed uneventfully, but just as Brian was preparing to wrap up his shift, the sleek black car pulled back up to the gate. Musk stepped out again, this time with the man in the tailored suit by his side. Brian's stomach tightened slightly, though his face betrayed no emotion. He straightened his posture and prepared to greet them. Mr. Musk, Brian said politely, inclining his head. Musk didn't respond immediately. Instead, he approached the desk, his hands tucked casually into his hoodie pockets. He studied Brian for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, Musk spoke. You're Brian, right? Yes, sir, Brian replied, his voice steady. Musk nodded. You were serious earlier. About following protocol. I respect that. Thank you, sir, Brian said, though he wasn't entirely sure where the conversation was headed. Musk glanced at the man in the suit, who nodded and handed Brian a small, unassuming envelope. This is for you, Musk said simply. Brian hesitated for a moment before taking the envelope. It felt heavier than he expected. "Open it later," Musk added, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And keep doing what you're doing. The world needs more people like you." With that, Musk turned and walked away, leaving Brian standing at his desk, the envelope still in his hand. As soon as Musk was out of sight, curiosity got the better of Brian. He carefully opened the envelope, revealing a handwritten note and what looked like a sleek black card. The note was brief but striking. To Brian. "For your unwavering commitment to integrity and fairness. Elon." The card, upon closer inspection, turned out to be an invitation to an exclusive event hosted by Musk himself, a gathering of individuals whom the CEO deemed to be exemplary in their fields. Brian stared at the note and the card, a mixture of disbelief and gratitude washing over him. It wasn't about the recognition or the invitation. It was about what it symbolized. In a world where cutting corners and bending the rules often seemed to be the norm, Brian had chosen to stand firm. And, for once, it felt like someone had truly seen him not just as a security guard, but as a person who valued principles above all else. As he tucked the envelope safely into his pocket, Brian allowed himself a small smile. The day that had started as just another ordinary shift had turned into something he would never forget. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The rest of Brian's shift went by in a blur, the envelope's weight still lingering in his pocket as a quiet reminder of the unexpected turn his day had taken. As he locked up the front desk and prepared to leave, he couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow, the world would return to its usual rhythm, but Brian would carry this moment with him, a testament to the power of doing the right thing, even when no one seemed to notice. Little did he know, the ripples of his decision would extend far beyond the walls of the building, setting in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. Brian stood firm, his feet planted as if rooted to the polished floor beneath him. The tension in the air was almost palpable, like a coiled spring ready to snap. The line of cars behind the sleek black vehicle grew longer by the minute, their drivers honking impatiently. Still, Brian showed no sign of yielding. "Sorry, sir," Brian repeated, his tone polite but resolute. "No badge, no entry." The man in front of him, jeans, hoodie, and an expression of mounting disbelief, took a step closer, his hands spreading in an exaggerated display of exasperation. "You can't seriously be doing this," he said, his voice rising slightly. Brian didn't flinch. He didn't blink. His calm demeanor seemed to fuel the man's frustration further. But what the man didn't realize, and what no one around them knew, was that Brian had his reasons. His diligence wasn't born from arrogance or stubbornness. It was a hard-learned lesson, one etched deeply into his memory. Years ago, during a previous security job, Brian had let his guard down. A rushed guest had claimed to be a top-level executive but had no identification. Wanting to avoid conflict, Brian had let the person through. Hours later, chaos erupted. The so-called executive was an imposter who gained access to sensitive areas of the building, leading to a costly data breach. Brian had carried the weight of that mistake ever since. It wasn't just the company's financial loss that haunted him, it was the feeling that he had failed in his duty. He'd vowed never to let it happen again. So now, standing face to face with a man who claimed to be Elon Musk, Brian couldn't afford to make assumptions. Celebrity or not, rules were rules. Behind him, a group of employees had gathered near the entrance, their voices low but buzzing with curiosity. "Isn't that Elon Musk?" one of them whispered, eyes widening as they peered at the man in the hoodie. "It has to be," another replied. "Look at the car, the way he's talking, it's definitely him." "I don't know," a third voice chimed in, skeptical. "Why wouldn't he have his badge? Doesn't everyone know they need one to get in?" Brian overheard the murmurs but kept his focus on the man in front of him. If he's Elon Musk, Brian thought, he'll have the proper credentials or he'll figure out how to get them. The man sighed heavily, pulling out his phone and glancing at the time. This is ridiculous, he muttered, more to himself than to Brian. Then, louder, he added, look, I have an important meeting upstairs. Just let me in, and we can avoid all this unnecessary drama. Brian shook his head, his expression unchanging. I can't do that, sir. If you don't have a badge, I can issue you a temporary one after verifying your identity. Otherwise, I can't let you through. The man opened his mouth to argue further but stopped himself, his jaw tightening. He stared at Brian for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to push the issue or back down. Finally, he said, you really don't know who I am, do you? Brian met his gaze evenly. It doesn't matter who you are, sir. Everyone follows the same rules here. The crowd of employees watching from the sidelines grew more animated, their whispers turning into hushed debates. He's sticking to his guns, someone said, a note of admiration in their voice. Yeah, but is that smart? If that really is Elon Musk, he could get fired for this. Or promoted, another argued. Management loves a guy who sticks to protocol. Brian tuned out the chatter. His focus was entirely on the man in front of him, whose irritation seemed to shift into something else, something harder to read. After another beat of silence, the man stepped back and crossed his arms, his expression shifting from frustration to faint amusement. All right, he said, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Let's play it your way. Call upstairs. Have someone vouch for me. Brian nodded, relieved to have a path forward but careful not to show it. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for the executive floor. As he waited for the line to connect, Brian noticed the man watching him closely. It wasn't the annoyed glare he'd expected, instead, it was a thoughtful, almost analytical gaze, as though the man were trying to figure Brian out. The phone clicked, and a calm voice on the other end said, Executive Office, how can I help you? This is Brian at the security desk, he began, his voice steady. I have a visitor here claiming to be Mr. Elon Musk. He doesn't have his badge and is requesting access. Can someone confirm his appointment? There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a flurry of activity. Brian could hear muffled voices in the background, the rustle of papers, and the faint tapping of a keyboard. Finally, the voice returned. Yes, Mr. Musk is scheduled for a meeting with the board. I'll send someone down to escort him. Thank you, Brian said, hanging up the phone. He turned back to Musk and said, Someone will be here shortly to confirm your entry, sir. The man nodded, his smirk widening slightly. See? That wasn't so hard, was it? Brian didn't respond, his expression remaining neutral. He wasn't here to engage in banter or score points. His job was to ensure the process was followed, and he had done just that. As they waited for the escort to arrive, the man spoke again. You're really serious about this, aren't you? Yes, sir, Brian replied. The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. Most people would have folded by now. Either they'd be too scared of who I am or too eager to impress me. But not you. Brian said nothing, unsure how to respond. A few moments later, the elevator doors opened, and a senior executive stepped out, his face slightly flushed from hurrying. Mr. Musk, he said, approaching quickly. We're so sorry for the inconvenience. No problem, Musk said casually, glancing back at Brian. Your guy here was just doing his job. Can't fault him for that. The executive looked relieved, though still flustered. Right, of course. Let's get you upstairs. Musk gave Brian one last look before following the executive toward the elevators. You've got a good one here, he said over his shoulder, nodding toward Brian. The doors closed, and the lobby slowly returned to its usual hum of activity. But for Brian, the moment lingered. He had done his job, yes, but something about the encounter felt significant. There was a shift in the air, as though the gears of fate had started turning in a new direction. As he returned to his desk and logged the interaction in his records, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last he'd see of Elon Musk or the last time his dedication to protocol would be put to the test. The day continued as usual, but in the back of his mind, Brian knew that small moments like these often carried the weight of something larger. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. As the elevator doors slid shut, taking Elon Musk and the senior executive upstairs, Brian allowed himself a slow, measured exhale. He straightened his uniform and returned to his workstation, his mind still buzzing with the subtle weight of the encounter. He knew he had done his duty, but the uneasy hum of whispers among the employees still loitering in the lobby hinted at a larger ripple effect. "Did you see his face?" one woman murmured to a colleague. "I can't believe Brian actually made Elon Musk wait." "Yeah, but Musk didn't seem that mad," her co-worker replied, glancing toward the security desk. "He almost looked impressed." Brian heard them but kept his eyes on his monitor. If he let every stray comment distract him, he'd never get anything done. Still, the murmurs didn't stop, growing louder as the news of the encounter spread through the building like wildfire. Upstairs, in the polished glass-walled boardroom, Elon Musk leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze fixed on the executives gathered around the table. The meeting was underway, but his mind drifted momentarily to the security guard downstairs. "Brian," Musk muttered to himself, filing the name away. "What was that?" one of the board members asked, glancing up from a presentation. "Nothing," Musk replied, waving it off. But inwardly, he made a mental note to follow up. For someone in Musk's position, it wasn't often that he encountered people willing to push back. It wasn't defiance, though, it was a quiet confidence, a commitment to something larger than the man in front of him. That kind of integrity wasn't just rare, it was invaluable. Back at the security desk, Brian was working through the afternoon rush. Packages arrived in bulk, visitors filtered in and out, and his phone rang more than usual. The lobby felt like a living, breathing organism, constantly shifting and adapting to the flow of people and tasks. But as busy as it was, Brian couldn't help noticing the sidelong glances from employees passing by. Some were curious, others seemed almost approving, but there were also a few skeptical faces in the mix. Not everyone was impressed by what had happened. "Hey, Brian," a familiar voice called out. It was Melissa, one of the front office admins, stopping by his desk with a clipboard in hand. "Melissa," Brian greeted, glancing up from his monitor. She leaned on the desk, lowering her voice. "So, word is, you stood up to Elon Musk." "True." Brian hesitated for a moment before responding. "I followed protocol. That's all." Melissa smirked. "Oh, come on. You're telling me you weren't even a little nervous? The guy's practically a global icon." Brian shrugged. "It doesn't matter who someone is. Rules are rules. If I make exceptions, where does it stop?" Her smirk softened into something closer to admiration. "You're either incredibly brave or just stubborn, Brian. Maybe both." She left before he could reply, her comment lingering in his mind. Later that evening, as the building began to quiet down, Brian found himself reflecting on the day's events. He knew he'd made the right decision, but doubt crept in like a shadow. What if upper management didn't see it that way? What if someone filed a complaint about his unnecessary rigidity? The memory of his past mistake resurfaced, sharper now. That single lapse in judgment had cost him more than a job, it had dented his confidence. He'd spent years rebuilding it, piece by painstaking piece. Today had tested all of that. But amidst the doubt, there was also something else, a sense of pride. It wasn't often that he stood out in his role. Security guards were meant to blend into the background, to go unnoticed unless something went wrong. Today, however, Brian had become the center of attention, and not for a mistake, but for standing firm. The next morning, Brian arrived early, as always. The lobby was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of early sunlight filtering through the tall glass windows. He set up his station, running through his usual checks. At 8:15 a.m., the first employees began trickling in, their greetings more animated than usual. "Morning, Brian," a marketing associate said, her tone cheerful. "Good morning," he replied, slightly taken aback by her enthusiasm. Similar interactions continued throughout the morning. Some employees offered knowing smiles, others gave small nods of approval. It was as if Brian's steadfastness had earned him an invisible badge of honor among the staff. Around mid-morning, a man in a sharply tailored suit approached the desk. Brian recognized him immediately. It was the same man who had accompanied Musk the day before. "Brian," the man said, his tone professional but warm. "Mr. Musk asked me to deliver this." He handed over a small envelope, its edges crisp and clean. Brian accepted it cautiously, glancing up at the man. "Thank you," he said, though his curiosity burned. The man gave a polite nod before walking away, leaving Brian alone with the envelope. He stared at it for a moment, then carefully opened it. Inside was a simple card, embossed with the Tesla and SpaceX logos. Beneath them, a handwritten note. "To Brian. Your commitment to principles doesn't go unnoticed. Keep it up. Elon." Brian read the note twice, his heart pounding slightly. It wasn't flashy or overly elaborate, but the message carried weight. For someone like Elon Musk to take the time to acknowledge him, it was more than Brian could have ever expected. The day went on, but the note remained in Brian's pocket, a quiet reminder of the moment that had unfolded. As he manned the front desk, his interactions with employees seemed subtly different. There was a newfound respect in their tones, a recognition that hadn't been there before. By the time his shift ended, Brian felt an unfamiliar sense of lightness. It wasn't just the note or the compliments, it was the validation of knowing he'd stayed true to his values. But deep down, Brian suspected this wasn't the end of the story. The events of the past 2 days had stirred something in the air, a sense that bigger things were on the horizon. For now, though, Brian was content to take it one day at a time, knowing he had done his part to stand firm in a world that often demanded compromise. And as he walked out of the building that evening, the faint glow of satisfaction lingered, carrying him into whatever came next. Minutes passed like hours as the tension thickened in the lobby. The soft murmur of employees speculating in hushed tones filled the air. Brian remained at his post, his face calm but his pulse thrumming. He had no way of knowing how this would end, but he trusted his principles. Protocol was protocol, no matter who stood on the other side of the desk. Suddenly, the elevator doors opened with a chime, and out rushed a senior manager. His tie was slightly askew, and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. The man's hurried steps echoed across the polished floor, his expression a mix of panic and frustration. "Brian," the manager barked, his voice carrying the weight of an impending reprimand. "What's going on here? Why is Mr. Musk still outside?" The eyes of everyone in the lobby snapped to Brian, who didn't flinch under the pressure. He squared his shoulders, his voice steady. "He didn't have a badge," Brian explained. "I followed protocol." The manager's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. You what?" he stammered. "Brian, do you realize who he is? That's Elon Musk out there." Before the manager could continue, the sound of approaching footsteps silenced him. Elon Musk himself stepped into the lobby, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The murmurs grew louder, rippling through the crowd like wildfire. Brian noticed the subtle shift in Musk's demeanor. He no longer seemed annoyed or rushed. Instead, there was a curious gleam in his eye, as though he were observing Brian from a fresh perspective. "You know what?" Musk said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I like this guy." The manager froze, his mouth agape. "Mr. Musk, I..." But Musk raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture. "No, really. I mean it. This guy's doing his job, and he's doing it well. You don't see that much anymore." A stunned hush fell over the lobby. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, their disbelief mirrored in each other's faces. Brian, the lowly security guard, had just earned the respect of the world's most famous entrepreneur not by catering to his demands, but by sticking to his principles. Musk turned his full attention to Brian now, studying him with an almost analytical gaze. "What's your name?" he asked. "Brian Carter," came the reply, calm and unwavering. "Well, Brian Carter," Musk said, a small smile playing on his lips. "You're a rare breed. Most people would have caved under the pressure or tried to suck up. But not you." Brian said nothing, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not like this. The manager, still flustered, tried to salvage the situation. "Mr. Musk, I assure you this was just a misunderstanding. Brian here is new." "I've been here 2 years, Brian interjected, his tone even but firm. The manager shot him a warning look, but Musk's laugh interrupted the moment. It was a genuine, hearty sound that echoed through the space. "2 years, huh?" Musk said, raising an eyebrow. "And in all that time, no one's managed to bend you. Impressive." He paused, glancing around the lobby, taking in the sea of faces watching the exchange. "You all could learn something from this guy," Musk said, addressing the crowd. "He's not afraid to stand his ground. And in a world full of yes people, that's worth a lot." Brian felt a strange warmth spreading through him. It wasn't pride exactly, but a deep sense of validation. For so long, he'd been the invisible figure in the background, the one no one noticed unless something went wrong. But now, in this moment, he wasn't just a security guard. He was someone who mattered. The murmurs resumed, but now they carried a different tone: admiration, respect, even awe. Brian caught snippets of conversations as employees whispered among themselves. "Can you believe it? Musk's actually praising him. He's got guts, that's for sure. Maybe I should start following protocol better." Musk turned back to the manager, his tone shifting to a more business-like cadence. "You've got someone valuable here," he said, nodding toward Brian. "Don't take that for granted." The manager nodded quickly, his face still flushed. "Of course, Mr. Musk. We'll, make sure Brian's efforts are recognized." Musk smirked, clearly seeing through the corporate platitude. "Good. Now, can someone get me to my meeting?" The manager practically tripped over himself in his eagerness to oblige, motioning Musk toward the elevators. But before he stepped away, Musk turned back to Brian one last time. "Brian," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Keep doing what you're doing. The world needs more people like you." As the elevator doors closed behind Musk, the lobby erupted into quiet applause. It wasn't loud or coordinated, but a spontaneous show of respect from the employees who had witnessed the exchange. Brian felt his cheeks flush, but he didn't let the attention overwhelm him. He simply nodded, acknowledging the moment before returning to his station. There was still work to do. For the rest of the day, the energy in the building felt different. Employees who had once walked past Brian without a second glance now greeted him with smiles or nods. Some stopped to thank him for his professionalism, others simply gave him a thumbs up as they passed. But it wasn't the recognition that stuck with Brian, it was the principle. He had stood firm in the face of pressure, not knowing how things would turn out. And in doing so, he had proven something to himself. Sometimes, The right thing wasn't the easiest thing. But as Brian returned to his duties, he knew that standing up for his values had been worth every second of uncertainty. The quiet hum of the building resumed after Musk's departure, but the weight of the encounter lingered. Employees went back to their desks and routines, but Brian's role, which had been so invisible and uncelebrated until now, suddenly felt more significant. The atmosphere had shifted in subtle yet undeniable ways. The respect he had earned from a single interaction with one of the world's most powerful men was transforming how he was viewed. At lunch, as Brian sat in the break room by himself, quietly eating his sandwich, a few employees came by. They didn't sit at his table but leaned against the wall nearby, exchanging knowing glances. It was clear they were discussing him. One of them, a young tech developer with wild, curly hair, smiled at him before speaking. "Brian, I gotta say, that was pretty impressive this morning," the developer said, still grinning. "You stood up to Elon Musk like he was just another guy trying to sneak in without his badge. You really didn't flinch, huh?" Brian looked up from his lunch and shrugged, not quite sure what to say. "I just did my job." The developer raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Yeah, but you did it right when everyone else would have folded." "I respect that." Another employee, a woman from marketing, nodded in agreement. "I overheard the whole thing. Musk seemed kind of impressed, don't you think?" Brian was quiet for a moment. He wasn't used to being the topic of conversation, especially not in such a positive light. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm just doing what I was hired for." The tech developer clapped him on the back. "I don't know about that, Brian. You've got more grit than most of us here. We don't see people like that too often." Brian forced a small smile. He was grateful for the compliment but wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't used to compliments, and even less to being admired for his role. But something about today felt different. It wasn't just the respect he had gained, it was the confidence it gave him. For the first time in years, he felt like his work mattered. Later that afternoon, Brian received a call from his supervisor, Karen. She was an older woman, known for being meticulous and by the book. If anyone would have a problem with how Brian handled the situation, it would be her. He answered the phone with a sense of apprehension. "Brian," Karen's voice crackled through the receiver. "I need to have a word with you. Can you come to my office?" Brian's stomach tightened. He wondered if his moment of standing up to Musk had caused more trouble than it was worth. He had been prepared for some sort of reprimand for not letting Musk in without proper identification. But as he made his way to Karen's office, the weight of the unknown pressed on him. Karen's office was as orderly and neat as ever. Her desk was meticulously organized, and the soft lighting gave the room a serious yet warm feel. When Brian entered, she motioned for him to sit down. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were focused on him. "Sit down, Brian," Karen said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. "I heard about what happened earlier. I need to know exactly what you said to Mr. Musk." Brian took a deep breath and recounted the events of the morning, explaining how Musk had arrived without his badge, and how he had followed protocol without hesitation. Karen listened intently, her brow furrowing occasionally as she processed his words. When he finished, there was a long pause. "Do you realize," Karen said slowly, "what you've done today?" Brian swallowed hard. "I just did my job." "No, Brian," she said, leaning forward, her tone softer now. "You didn't just do your job. You did something most people would have been afraid to do. You stood firm, and that's something we can't overlook. I've worked with people here for years, and they've all been too eager to please, to get ahead, even when it meant bending the rules." She paused for a moment, choosing her next words carefully. "And you didn't do that. You upheld what was right, regardless of who was standing in front of you." Brian blinked, not quite believing what he was hearing. "You're saying I did the right thing?" Karen gave him a sharp nod. "Absolutely. You did. And I want to make sure that doesn't go unnoticed. I'm going to recommend that your performance be reviewed for a possible promotion. You've earned that much. You've shown more integrity today than many of the higher UPS here ever will." Brian sat frozen for a moment, the words sinking in. He wasn't sure what to say, but his heart raced as he finally muttered, "Thank you." Karen smiled at him, a rare, genuine expression. "You're welcome. Keep it up, Brian. People like you, people who stick to their values, are rare in this company. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As Brian left Karen's office, his mind buzzed with disbelief. A promotion? He couldn't remember the last time anyone had taken his contribution seriously enough to even consider something like that. His entire career up until this point had been defined by being overlooked, underestimated, and unrecognized. And now, he was being praised, acknowledged, and even offered a chance to advance. He returned to his post, feeling like he was walking on air. His phone buzzed a few minutes later. It was a message from his friend Tom, who worked in the tech department. "Dude, I just heard you're getting promoted. That's insane. You're officially a legend around here now. You deserve it, man." Brian couldn't help but laugh. It felt surreal, like he was living someone else's life. But the truth was, he had earned it. His dedication to doing the right thing, to staying true to his principles, had paid off in ways he never could have imagined. That evening, as Brian packed up his things to leave for the day, a familiar face approached him, Melissa, the admin who had spoken to him earlier. She smiled warmly as she stepped up to the desk. "Brian, I just wanted to say congratulations," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "I heard about the promotion. You really earned it." Brian smiled, humbled but grateful for the recognition. "Thanks, Melissa. I still can't believe it, honestly." Melissa chuckled. "It's about time someone recognized the quiet ones. You've been here longer than most of the people in this building, and you do your job with more heart than anyone else. I'm just glad to see it's finally paying off for you." Her words hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment, he found himself speechless. The respect he was getting from people, his co-workers, his supervisors, even Elon Musk himself, felt so foreign to him. But it felt real, too. As he walked out of the building that evening, Brian's thoughts swirled with everything that had transpired. The validation he had received, the respect he had earned, and the new path that lay before him, it all felt like something out of a dream. And yet, it was real. He had stood firm when others might have faltered. He had chosen the right thing over convenience. And in doing so, he had changed his own life. For the first time, Brian felt like he truly belonged. Later that day, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the campus, Brian returned to his post. His feet felt heavier than usual, the weight of everything that had happened still fresh in his mind. The lobby had returned to its usual rhythm, the hum of keyboards and chatter echoing throughout the building. But for Brian, nothing felt the same. His life had changed in ways he hadn't fully understood yet. As he sat back down behind the security desk, his phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a new email notification from an address he didn't recognize except for the words Elon Musk's office. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm as he opened the message. The email was short and to the point. "We're impressed with your commitment. Let's talk." Brian stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the words. It felt surreal. He had done his job, followed protocol, stood firm, and now here he was, receiving a message from the CEO of one of the world's most powerful companies. His mind raced. What did this mean? What was he being asked to talk about? He sat back in his chair, still processing the sudden turn his life had taken. As if on cue, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Karen, his supervisor. "Brian, I just heard from HR. There's a meeting with Elon's team tomorrow. They want to discuss something with you. Make sure you're ready." Brian's heart skipped a beat. This was happening. His mind raced, but his hands remained steady. He couldn't help but smile. This was far beyond anything he had ever imagined for himself. Word about the morning's incident had spread like wildfire across the campus. The employees who had once passed by Brian without a second glance now looked at him with newfound respect. He noticed people nodding at him in the hallways, offering quiet words of admiration. He had gone from being just another face behind the desk to someone whose actions had made an impact. A few of the junior employees, including the tech developer who had spoken to him earlier, came up to him that afternoon. They seemed eager to talk, almost as if they couldn't believe what had just transpired. "Brian," the developer said with a grin, "I just heard Elon Musk himself." "Man, you really did it?" Brian smiled, still processing everything that had happened. "I just followed the rules. It's what I was supposed to do." The developer laughed, shaking his head. "You know, most people would have let him in. I'm sure if anyone else had been at that gate, they would have let him slide. But you didn't. That takes guts." Another employee, this one from HR, chimed in, "Yeah, I overheard the whole thing. When I heard it was Musk, I couldn't believe it. But you didn't even blink. That's real integrity, Brian. You set a new standard around here." Brian shrugged, trying to downplay the praise. "I'm just doing my job. Anyone else would have done the same." But even as he spoke, a sense of pride started to swell in his chest. The kind of pride that comes from knowing you've made the right decision, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be. As the hours passed, word continued to spread. The once quiet and dismissive employees now greeted Brian with warm smiles and handshakes. It was as if a new respect for him had suddenly appeared overnight. But Brian wasn't about to let it get to his head. He remained focused, doing what he had always done, his job. He didn't need anyone's approval, not really. But it was nice to be recognized for something he believed in. Even the manager who had scolded him earlier came over to Brian's desk that afternoon. The man seemed genuinely uncomfortable as he approached, his steps hesitant. When he reached Brian, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Brian, I owe you an apology," the manager said, avoiding eye contact. "I was wrong earlier. You were just doing your job, and you were right. I should have backed you up instead of rushing to judgment." Brian looked up at him, nodding. "It's okay. You were just doing your job too." The manager gave him a weak smile, clearly relieved to have made amends. "Still, I wanted to make sure you knew that I respect what you did today. You did the right thing, and I hope you get the recognition you deserve for it." Brian nodded, feeling a small weight lift off his shoulders. The apology wasn't necessary, but it was appreciated. He didn't need to be liked by everyone, but it felt good to know that his actions had been acknowledged, even by those who had doubted him. Later that evening, as Brian sat in his small apartment, his phone buzzed once again. This time, it was a reminder from HR about the meeting with Elon Musk's team the next day. He felt his heart race at the thought. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the uncertainty was both terrifying and exhilarating. He took a deep breath and set his phone down, trying to calm the growing excitement in his chest. His mind flashed back to the morning, to that tense moment at the gate. The anger, the frustration from Musk, it all felt so distant now, replaced by this strange feeling of anticipation. The next day came quickly, and before Brian knew it, he was sitting in a conference room, his palms sweating slightly as he waited for the meeting to begin. He had been told to dress casually, as it wasn't a formal interview, but the gravity of the situation still weighed heavily on him. Elon Musk's team arrived promptly. The first to enter was a middle-aged man who introduced himself as Steve, Musk's right-hand person. He shook Brian's hand firmly before taking a seat across from him. "You're Brian Carter, right?" Steve asked, his voice warm but businesslike. Brian nodded. "Yes, that's me." "Good. Let's cut to the chase," Steve said, his eyes scanning Brian's face as if weighing him. "We've been watching you, and we like what we see. Your commitment, your resolve, those are qualities we value. And after the events of yesterday, we'd like to extend an offer to you." Brian's stomach flipped. He tried to keep his composure, but the words were sinking in slowly, almost unreal. "An offer?" Steve nodded. "Yes, an offer. We're offering you a position on our security team, but not just any position. You'll be working directly with our top executives, handling security in a more strategic role. It's a step up from what you're doing now. You'll be overseeing a team, helping us shape the future of security operations." Brian sat there, speechless for a moment. The weight of the offer was almost too much to process. A position working directly with top executives? Overseeing a team? It was more than he could have ever dreamed of. "You'll be making a significant increase in pay, of course," Steve continued, as though reading his thoughts. "But more importantly, you'll have a chance to grow within the company. We think you have what it takes to go far." Brian couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was the kind of opportunity he had only imagined in passing, never truly believing it could happen to him. Yet here it was, being offered to him. I don't know what to say," Brian finally stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "I never expected anything like this." Steve smiled. "That's the thing, Brian. Sometimes, doing the right thing, even when it's hard, opens doors you never saw coming. You've proven that, and we think you're ready for this next step." As Brian left the meeting that day, he felt like he was walking on air. His entire life had changed in the course of just one day. The offer was real, the recognition was real, and most importantly, the justice he had so patiently waited for was finally being served. He had stood up for what was right, had followed protocol when it seemed easier to bend the rules, and in doing so, he had earned the respect of not only his peers but of the most powerful individuals in the business world. This was just the beginning. The road ahead was filled with new challenges, opportunities, and possibilities, things Brian had never dared to dream of before. And now, thanks to his unwavering commitment, he had the chance to shape a future that was entirely his own. Sometimes, doing the right thing isn't easy, especially when it feels like no one is watching. It's easy to give in when you feel the weight of the world against you, when the path to success seems clear but also crooked. It's tempting to take shortcuts, to bend the rules just a little bit, or to let someone else handle the difficult choices. But what Brian Carter learned, in a way that would change his life forever, was that integrity doesn't always show up when it's convenient, and it's rarely the easy choice. For Brian, it wasn't about recognition or reward at first. It wasn't even about proving himself. All he wanted to do was his job, simple as that. And yet, in that one decision, in that single moment where he stood firm at the gate, he found out something no one had told him before: doing the right thing is often the hardest, but it can also be the most rewarding. Brian's life hadn't been glamorous. For years, he had gone unnoticed. He'd been the person who opened the doors, who stood watch in the background, never the one who got the praise or the glory. But that day at the gate, when he decided to follow protocol instead of taking the easier path, he unknowingly set off a chain of events that would change everything. The pressure to let Elon Musk through was real. The impatient honks of the cars behind him, the murmurs from the people around him, everyone expected Brian to back down. Even his own doubts crept in. What if this wasn't the right thing to do? What if he was ruining his only chance at anything more in life? But Brian didn't give in to the pressure. He didn't let the weight of those who doubted him cloud his judgment. He stayed true to the principle that had carried him this far: do your job, and do it well. And in that simple act of standing firm, something remarkable happened. It wasn't just about stopping a billionaire from entering the campus. It was about standing for what was right, for upholding the values that he believed in even when it wasn't the easy thing to do. That act, small to some, was noticed. Elon Musk had noticed. And in the moments that followed, something else became clear to Brian: doing what's right doesn't always have instant rewards, but in the end, it's what makes you stand out from the rest. It would have been easy for Brian to let Elon in, to get the approval of his boss and the people around him, to avoid the awkward tension and the angry looks. But instead, Brian stayed true to his principles. He did what was right, even when no one was watching, even when it felt like there would be no reward at the end. It's easy to do what's expected of you when the world is applauding you for it, but doing the right thing when no one is watching, that's where true integrity lies. When the day ended, and Brian looked back on the events that had unfolded, he realized something he had never truly understood before. Integrity wasn't about recognition, fame, or reward. It was about doing what was right in the moments when no one else would. The truth is, those moments are the ones that matter the most. They're the ones that define us. Brian didn't know that standing his ground that morning would lead to an offer from one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs. He didn't know that a single act of responsibility would transform his future forever. But what he did know, deep down, was that he had made the right choice. And sometimes, that's all that matters. The respect that followed, the job offer, the admiration from his peers, those were the results of doing the right thing. But those were just the icing on the cake. What really mattered was that he had proved to himself that integrity has a way of shining through, even in the darkest of moments. In a world full of shortcuts, of people willing to bend the rules for personal gain or convenience, those who stand their ground are the ones who truly stand out. It's easy to take the easy road. It's tempting to follow the crowd, to cut corners, and to do whatever it takes to reach the top. But in the end, the people who truly succeed are the ones who don't compromise their values. They are the ones who build their success on the solid foundation of honesty, hard work, and dedication. It's easy to think that doing the right thing doesn't matter when the world seems to reward those who take the shortcuts. But what Brian Carter found was that doing what's right, even when no one notices, can lead to something bigger than you could have ever imagined. It's a reminder that the right choices, no matter how small, make all the difference. As Brian moved forward with his new job, with his new opportunities, he carried with him something that no one could take away. He had earned the respect of the people who mattered, and more importantly, he had earned his own self-respect. That's a kind of success no one can buy. It's the kind of success that comes from knowing you did things the right way, even when the world tried to tell you otherwise. Sometimes, the greatest rewards come not from the achievements themselves but from knowing that, at the end of the day, you can stand tall because you made the right decision. In the quiet moments of reflection, when Brian thought back to that day at the gate, he knew that was the moment that had changed everything. Not because of the job offer or the praise, but because it had shown him what he was truly capable of when he stayed true to himself. So, when you find yourself at a crossroads, when the choice seems difficult or the pressure to conform feels overwhelming, remember Brian's story. Remember that the right thing isn't always the easy thing, and that integrity doesn't always come with instant rewards. But in the end, it will lead you to the place where you are meant to be. The world may try to knock you down, but if you stand firm and do what's right, you'll find your way to success just as Brian did. In a world full of shortcuts, it's the ones who stand their ground that truly stand out. And sometimes, that's all that matters.